Are you doing these things wrong in French? Maybe you're a beginner. Maybe you've been learning for a while. But there are some typical fautes or mistakes or errors that we English speakers can make when speaking French. And it'd be a shame not to address at least some of them, to try and get them right, because it can make a huge difference to being understood and just make you feel better about yourself and your learning journey. The first 4 things I'm going to talk about today are related to how you speak, so they're pronunciation issues. And then the last one, which might surprise you, is a grammar issue. Not a complicated one, but a common one, and one that we should be able to sort out by talking it through. Let's look at the first 4 to do with pronunciation. Before I say what number 1 is, I should add I'm far, far from perfect. I didn't grow up speaking French. It's not my first language, so I've had to learn these things too. However, I am a qualified French teacher, and I've been a learner of French for nearly 50 years, so it may be worth your while listening to what I have to say on this. Going with that term native speaker for a moment, no matter what its problems. Of course, it's useful and probably the most useful thing to learn from a native speaker, particularly if they understand their own language very well, or if they have been trained to teach it, but also just to hear how they speak, because that's the language as it is spoken. Okay. There's also, however, usefulness in having help from someone who is a speaker of that language who learned it, especially if they come from the same original language as yourself, because they will understand why you're making the errors or having the stumbling blocks that you are. Those of us on the English side of it think, okay, I know why that's happening because I've been there myself. So it's great to have a balance between the two, but always for listening and for colloquial expressions and for the whole richness of the language, learning from a native speaker, so-called teacher, is great. Do you find yourself saying words like puis, P-U-I-S, then, or depuis, since, D-E-P-U-I-S? Do you find you're saying puis and depuis? Well, it might be because you've been taught to say them that way by someone who's not really a French speaker or is also a learner or has a particular accent. That's fine. But it can get confusing for people who hear it because the U sound is actually a narrow sound there. It also doesn't help that many textbooks write pronunciation explanations with English sounds, so they'll write P-W-E-E for puis. And in fact, it's not a W sound at all, certainly not the sound we mean in English when we make a W sound, not a W sound. The best thing I can recommend with things like this is to actually listen to some good videos on YouTube of people pronouncing it correctly. Once you've heard it, there's no going back. In most cases, if you say puis and depuis, you'll still be understood. It'll just come across as an accent. And, you know, just as the French accent can sound charming in English, I'm sure, I hope, that some French speakers find our English accent charming, maybe. But if you want to be clearer, you've got to try to narrow that U sound, U. French does have a wider, fuller sound for U, but it's spelt with an OU, oo. And it can make a huge difference to what you're saying and sometimes be very embarrassing if you get that sound wrong. So we say depuis and puis. And this may solve the mystery for you of why when you hear French speakers talking really fast, they seem to say puis, as if they were saying P-I for then. They're not actually saying a different word. They're just making a very narrow sound very quickly. Practice saying puis and then say it in one, and you'll see what I mean. It's not a W, it's not a W. It's a totally different sound. The second problem I'm going to talk about today is still on the letter U. So I'm looking at you, U. This is issue number 2. And it's still to do with that U or OO sound, except the converse now. When you see the OU in French, it's not OO as it is in English, or many Englishes. It's a much rounder oo sound. Think of it as the O U sound being round. That's the best way to remember. Vous, in other words, does not rhyme with tu, the two words for you. You may think it's easier just to say vous when you're speaking about a person. Vous parlez, but it's not. And in a sentence to a French speaker, it could sound as if you're saying vu, V-U, which means seen, or V-U-E, the view. Okay, so there's actually a meaning difference between the oo and the u sounds there. That may seem trivial, and as I say, accents aren't such a big deal, but you don't want an embarrassing misunderstanding. For instance, when you say the word nous, we, meaning we people, you don't want to be heard as saying nu, naked or nude. You see what I mean? Sounds can make a difference. It's not about perfection, it's about communicating and being understood. We're up to number 3, that difficult, frightening sound on the ends of words that is often spelt E-U-I-L, but has other forms as well. Ui. Remember this from school days? I mean, when else would you talk a lot about armchairs? Fauteuil. Remember trying to avoid saying that word and hoping you wouldn't be the person asked to read it out or pronounce it. It has an ending shared with many other French words, sometimes spelled in other ways, which I'll put below. And it does, for some reason, frighten English speakers. Now, again, part of this is not helped by the fact that textbooks, which is where many of us first encounter the language, often have those English spelling explanations of a word. And I've come across resources that actually say to make the oi sound, that you make a sound like the vowels in book, B-O-O-K, or foot, F-O-O-T. And the problem with that, as you can hear straight away, is that maybe if you're Southern English, you say book and foot, so that might work. If you come from Western Australia like myself or other places, you'll have a round sound there, book and foot, which will end up in you saying, instead of the word feuille for leaf, you'll end up saying fouille, which means to dig or to excavate or to rummage, like rummaging in someone's bag. That's not what you want. So how are you going to get the correct sound here? Well, you can break it down into its parts, but I would say one of the best ways that you could deal with this is to actually bring up any number of YouTubers who are real French speakers. Now, when I say real French speakers, obviously those of us who are learning it or have learned it or will learn it are also real French speakers. But I suppose it's what people mean when they say native speaker, though as we know from some recent YouTubes, that can be a problematical term. Or someone who grew up speaking the language, someone who uses the language in their daily life and for whom it's a second skin or a first skin. So for instance, speak like a Parisian, and I'll put the references there so you can see, or someone like Prononciation avec Christophe, who puts great little videos with the mouth so you can actually watch what he's doing there to see how this sound is made. But note, especially at the end of these words, that you don't make an L sound as in English. It's a particular sound, but it's really not as frightening as you think. It's really quite straightforward. It just looks confusing because it has all those vowels together. Issue number 4, still on pronunciation now. What do these letters mean to you? E-N-T. Not ear, nose and throat. I'm talking in French, E-N-T. How would you say them? I guess you would say en, even though it looks like part of a word rather than a word. You've probably learned those nasal sounds, en, and you know that the en would make that sort of sound. However, when it occurs on the end of a verb in the third person plural, if you're saying en, you're tying yourself up in knots and you're making it harder for people to understand you. When it's the end of a verb in the third person, so they are doing something, they do the verb, the ENT on the end is silent. I know you've learned that rule, if you learn French at school especially, and yet for some reason our brains slip when we see it written and we want to pronounce it. We can't use English as an excuse because English does this with many words too. People all the time say things like, oh, why do the French leave off the pronunciation of the ends of words? But if you think of words in English like autumn we don't say that N on the end. Or limb or climb, we don't pronounce a B sound on the end, although it's kind of residually there in the M. But you see what I mean? It's actually more commonplace than you think. It's just a matter of remembering that it is so. Pense, P-E-N-S-E-N-T, which would be il pense ou elle pense, they think. Sounds like pense in the singular. You don't say pensant, which would be a different word, thinking, with a completely different manner of being used. We'll leave that one for now. That's a whole separate topic. Elle parle in the singular is elle parle in the plural. Elle finit, she finishes. Elle finisse, but not finisse. We're not going to say that last syllable. Elle ment, this is a tricky one, she's lying. But in the plural, elle ment. You do say that T because it's followed by a vowel-like syllable. But you don't say the ENT on the end, only in the part of the stem of the word ment and ment. Okay, so we don't make this mistake as frequently when speaking as we do when being asked to read out. So you might say, well, why does it matter? Well, in fact, in life, you're quite often going to have to read something out or, come across this issue. And it seems to be something that's really hard to train ourselves to do, even when we know the rule. The rule to keep in your head is when they do something. If you can't remember third person plural verbs, say they. When they do something, the verb with the ENT on the end, you don't pronounce the ENT. By the way, if you'd like me to do a whole separate video on endings in French that are not pronounced and how that works, let me know in the comments, because I'm happy to do that. It's just a whole topic that requires a separate treatment. For the time being, just focus on not pronouncing the ENT on the end of the third person plural verb. That's today's takeaway. And now at last, we come to number 5 mistake that people often make. It's a bit trickier. It's to do with grammar, not to do with pronunciation. And it has to do with the partitive article and how that changes. The partitive is something we don't think about so much in English, but in French, when you want to describe nouns or things that are indefinite, that there's not a definite amount of, so you're not saying the bread, you're saying bread. Or you're not saying the jam that I bought this morning, you're saying there is jam. You need, in most cases, a partitive article. Now, if you've learned some French already, you will have learned that this depends on the gender. Obviously, of the noun in the singular, you'll have du pain, which can mean bread or some bread. De la confiture, so that's feminine, jam, some jam. And in the plural, it will go des with a D-E-S. Okay, so far so good. Something happens though when an adjective comes between that partitive and its noun. And then we drop it and it becomes de again. You may or may not have noticed this. You may or may not have been taught it. Or if you were taught it, maybe it was only mentioned briefly. But it's a problem that you hear a lot. And there's a reason for that. We'll get into that in a minute. Why? Why is there a problem around this? So for instance, you have des tasses, cups, like teacups. We've had bread, we've had jam, we might as well have the coffee cup or the teacup. So it's des tasses, D-E-S. But if you get an adjective in between, de jolies tasses, pretty cups, it becomes de, not des. And I'm not going to say it the wrong way or it will stay in your mind, in your inner ear. Listen around you to the differences in what French speakers actually say. No, you are not mishearing. They do actually mostly say de in those cases. But if you listen to learners, you'll often hear it stubbornly stuck at des in every case. It seems logical because it's plural, but there's that pesky adjective in between, okay, which means it usually should be de. This is an easy fix if you train yourself, and you can best train yourself by listening to examples and practicing examples. But there is one problem, and that is that to every rule there is an exception. Here are some exceptions then, and this may be why you've been confused if you've heard the exceptions and you've thought, well, they're saying de, so why shouldn't I? Why should I say de when I'm hearing de? If the adjective and noun are a kind of fixed set, two words that normally go together, it will stay at de. This is because the adjective here has kind of dropped its separate function and is working as if it's, one word stuck together, as if they were just one thing. So instead of becoming like de jolies tasses, we have things like des bons plans, des bons plans, which are good deals or great ideas. And you'll often see that in advertising. So you'll hear it a lot. Here's some great deals on trips overseas, or here are some great ideas. Des bons plans. Or another example, des petits pois, peas. The des stays there because petits pois, not little peas, but peas. It is little peas literally, but it's how you refer to peas. Very fine peas. Those words belong together, so they're treated as if they're one thing and you keep the de. The exception, however, is just that. It's only for these kind of situations where the adjective and noun are welded together as a common expression. The rest of the time, when it's plural and an adjective comes between the partitive and the noun, it drops back to de jolies tasses. If you're a French learner in school, you may say this has never come up. But look carefully, especially if you're doing état, because it's actually mentioned in the syllabus. I'll put an example there to show you. De replacing the partitive before an adjective preceding a plural noun as something that should be addressed. It's just a little one-liner, so it's easy to miss. It's one way you can kind of tweak and improve your French, or if you like, lift your game in French. People will probably still understand you. In fact, I'm sure they will if you make the wrong choice here. But why not get it right? It's so easy to fix. Do you have other things that puzzle you in French and you would like to get them right? Please let me know in the comments and I'm happy to address them. Whatever you bring up, we'll do the work together.